Welcome, dear friends, to a heartbreaking story of love, loss, and redemption, where the tragedy of a wealthy family turns into an unexpected miracle. Enjoy the story. Richard Harrison's Lexus glided to a stop in the circular driveway of his Connecticut mansion. His heart clenched as he spotted his wife's silhouette through the floor-to-ceiling windows. There she was again, cleaning despite her condition. "Sandy, honey, what are you doing?" he called out, rushing through the grand foyer. The house felt cavernous, their footsteps echoing off marble floors that were once warmed by teenage laughter. Sandra turned, cloth still in hand, her face flushed with exertion. "Oh, Richard, you're home early. I was just overexerting yourself again," he interrupted, gently taking the cleaning supplies from her trembling hands. The doctors were crystal clear about this. It was only one window, she protested weakly, but her pale complexion betrayed her exhaustion. One window too many. Richard guided her to their imported Italian leather sofa. "I left an important meeting about the company Christmas party because I was worried about you." Sandra's eyes sparkled with a hint of her old mischief. "Lucy, giving you trouble about the party budget again? When isn't she?" Richard chuckled, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "You should have seen her face when I told her to work it out with accounting." "But Mr. Harrison," he mimicked his secretary's high-pitched voice, "you promised to handle the Christmas arrangements." "You always do," Sandra murmured, her gaze drifting to the spotless window she'd been cleaning. "Remember how Nathan used to love those parties?" The name hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Richard's jaw tightened, and Sandra's hand instinctively went to her chest, where her weakened heart struggled beneath designer silk. "Sandy," Richard began, but she cut him off. "I know what you're going to say, that we need to hire help, that this house is too big for me to maintain in my condition." She gestured at the immaculate room around them, every surface gleaming with desperate attention. "But keeping busy helps me forget, helps me stop wondering if somewhere out there. We tried everything," Richard reminded her gently, though the words felt like ashes in his mouth. "Every private investigator in the Northeast, every connection I had until that night." Sandra's eyes welled with tears. 5 years, Richard, 5 years since we lost him, and I still find myself cleaning his room, as if he might come home any minute and complain about me moving his things." Richard pulled her close, feeling her bird-like frame beneath his arms. The empire he'd built, the fortune he'd amassed, all of it meant nothing in the face of their loss. His mind wandered back to that fateful night, the night that had started their descent into this elegant hell of quiet rooms and endless regrets. "Promise me something," Sandra whispered against his expensive suit jacket. "Anything. Promise me you'll let me interview the housekeepers myself. I need to be sure about who we let into our home." Richard kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of Chanel No. 5 mixed with window cleaner. "Of course, darling, whatever you need." As the evening sun cast long shadows through the immaculate windows, the Harrisons sat in their perfect, empty home, haunted by the ghost of choices made and words they could never take back. The dining room of the Harrison mansion had always been a showcase of success, with its crystal chandelier and hand-painted Chinese wallpaper. But 5 years ago, it became the stage for a family tragedy that would echo through half a decade of sleepless nights and tear-stained pillows. "I've decided to become an artist," Nathan had announced over Dover sole and asparagus, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. The crystal glasses seemed to vibrate with the tension that immediately filled the room. Richard Harrison slowly lowered his fork, the sterling silver making a soft clink against Lenox china. "I must have misheard you, son." "No, Dad, you heard correctly." Nathan's chin lifted, showing the same determination that had made his father a titan of industry. "I'm not going to business school. I want to paint." Sandra's hand flew to her throat, fingers clutching her pearl necklace. "Nathan, darling, you can't be serious. Your father has spent years grooming you for the company." "That's exactly the problem, Mom." Nathan pushed back from the table, his chair scraping across ancient Persian carpet. You've both spent years planning my life without once asking what I wanted. Richard's face darkened to a dangerous shade of red. Planning your life? We've given you every advantage, every opportunity. To become you? Nathan shot back. But I'm not you, Dad. I don't want to spend my life in board meetings and hostile takeovers. I want to create something beautiful. Create something beautiful? Richard's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. And how exactly do you plan to support yourself with these drawings? They're paintings, Dad. And there are successful artists. Successful artists? Richard stood now, his 6'2" frame looming over the table. Let me tell you what success looks like, son. Success is the roof over your head, the car you drive, the credit cards in your wallet. Success is security. No, Dad, that's your definition of success. Nathan's voice grew quieter, more resolved. I'd rather live in a studio apartment and be true to myself than in a mansion and hate what I see in the mirror every morning. Sandra reached for her son's hand. Nathan, please be reasonable. Your father has built this company for you. No, Mom, he built it for himself. And now he wants to force me into his mold. Nathan pulled away from her grasp. I won't do it. I won't live his life. Richard's hand slammed down on the mahogany table, making the crystal dance. Then you won't live on my dime? I'm cutting you off, Nathan. Every account, every card, everything. Maybe sometime in the real world we'll knock this artistic nonsense out of your head. The silence that followed was deafening. Nathan stood slowly, reached into his back pocket and pulled out his wallet. With deliberate movements, he removed every credit card and placed them on the table. Keep them, he said softly. I never wanted your money, Dad. I just wanted your understanding. As Nathan walked out of the dining room, Sandra called after him. Nathan, please, where will you go? But the only answer was the distant sound of the front door closing. A quiet click that would echo through their lives for years to come. They didn't know then that it would be the last time they would see their son healthy and whole. They didn't know that their next family dinner would be in a hospital cafeteria, picking at vending machine sandwiches while their son fought for his life upstairs. The call came at 3:47 a.m., that witching hour when nothing good ever comes through a telephone line. Sandra reached for it first, her silk pajamas rustling in the dark. Hello? Her sleep-clouded voice suddenly sharpened. Nathan? Nathan, is that really you? Richard was already reaching for the bedside lamp, his heart thundering against his ribs. 2 years of silence, 2 years of private investigators and dead ends, 2 years of jumping at every phone call, and now this. Mom, Dad. The voice was so weak, so different from the confident young man who had walked out of their lives. I'm sorry. I'm in the hospital. Sandra's hand clutched Richard's arm, her nails digging through his pajama sleeve. Which hospital, sweetheart? We'll be right there. St. Mary's on the east side. A rattling cough. I'm dying, Mom. I needed to see you both one last time. Richard was already pulling on clothes, his usual methodical nature abandoned in desperate haste. We're coming, son. Just hold on. The drive to St. Mary's was a blur of red lights and Sandra's quiet prayers. Richard broke every speed limit, his Mercedes eating up the miles between their suburban mansion and the city hospital. The night nurse barely had time to direct them before they were running down fluorescent-lit corridors that smelled of disinfectant and despair. They found him in a private room, the monitors casting a sickly green glow over his emaciated face. Nathan Harrison, once the golden boy of Connecticut society, now lay skeletal and pale against sterile white sheets. Oh, my baby, Sandra sobbed, rushing to his bedside. What happened to you? Nathan's eyes fluttered open, ghostly shadows of his former vibrant green. Mom, Dad, you came. Of course we came, Richard choked out, his corporate armor cracking at the sight of his son's condition. We've been looking everywhere for you. I know. Nathan's smile was a pale shadow of its former self. I saw the investigators, but I couldn't. There was something I had to do first. Save your strength, sweetheart, Sandra pleaded, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. We'll get the best doctors. Well, no time, Nathan whispered. Need to tell you. Important. His breathing became more labored, and Richard lunged for the call button. "Nathan's son, please," Richard begged, all his power and wealth useless in the face of his child's mortality. "Just hold on. Whatever it is, we can fix it." But Nathan's eyes were already closing, his hand going slack in Sandra's grip. The monitors began their terrible keening, and suddenly the room was full of medical personnel pushing them aside, working with desperate efficiency to save a life that was already slipping away. In the chaos that followed, neither Richard nor Sandra heard their son's last whispered words, carried away on his final breath like autumn leaves in a winter wind. The drive home was silent, broken only by Sandra's quiet sobs. They had just passed through their grand gates when she clutched her chest and collapsed. The second emergency drive of the night was even more terrifying than the first, with Richard alternating between begging his wife to hold on and cursing the fate that seemed determined to destroy his family. The doctors saved Sandra's life, but her heart would never be the same. Like their home, like their lives, it was now fundamentally broken, beating on through sheer determination rather than joy. They returned to their mansion, now more mausoleum than home, to begin the long process of learning to live with grief. The Harrison mansion had seen its share of job interviews over the years, but none quite like this one. Sandra sat in her favorite armchair, a delicate china teacup balanced in her trembling hands as she faced the young woman before her. Mary Anderson wasn't what anyone would expect for a housekeeper position in one of Connecticut's most prestigious homes. She wore a simple dress from Target, her resume was printed on basic paper, and her references were more character witnesses than professional contacts. But there was something in her direct gaze that caught Sandra's attention. "I should be honest with you, Mrs. Harrison," Mary said, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I don't have extensive experience in homes like yours, but I'm a hard worker. I learn quickly, and right now I need this job more than I've ever needed anything." Sandra set down her teacup with a soft clink. "Tell me why, Mary. I have a son." Mary's voice softened with maternal pride. "He's 4 years old, and right now we're living in a motel. His father," she paused, swallowing hard. "His father disappeared when I was pregnant. Not because he didn't want us, he was sick, and he didn't want to be a burden. I never found out what happened to him." Sandra's hand fluttered to her chest, a gesture that had become habitual since her heart attack. "Your son, what's his name?" "Nathan," Mary replied, unaware of how the name landed like a thunderbolt in the quiet room. "Nathan Jr., actually. His father's name was Nathan too." Sandra's teacup clattered against its saucer. And this position with living quarters? It would help you both?" "It would be a miracle," Mary admitted. "Nathan's such a good boy. He's quiet, well-behaved, he loves to draw. He gets that from his father. He spends hours with his crayons, creating these amazing little pictures." Sandra stood abruptly, startling them both. "Excuse me a moment, I need to speak with my husband." She found Richard in his home office, surrounded by the trappings of corporate success. "Richard, I found our housekeeper." He looked up from his laptop, reading the emotion in her face. "Sandy, what is it?" "She has a child." Sandra rushed on before he could object. "A little boy, his name is Nathan." Richard's face darkened. "Sandy, I don't think, please," she interrupted. "Just meet them both. There's something I can't explain. But I feel it, Richard. For the first time since we lost him, I feel something other than grief." Richard studied his wife's face, noting the animation that had been missing for so long. "All right," he sighed. "But you're sure about this? A single mother with a child?" "I've never been more sure of anything," Sandra replied. And for the first time in years, her smile reached her eyes. When they returned to the living room, Mary was standing by the window, looking out at the manicured grounds. She turned as they entered, and Richard was struck by something familiar in her bearing, though he couldn't place it. "Mary," Sandra said warmly, "we'd like to offer you the position. When can you start?" The young woman's eyes filled with tears. "Really? You mean it? We could move in this weekend, if that's not too soon." "This weekend would be perfect," Sandra assured her, while Richard watched his wife come alive with purpose for the first time in years. None of them knew it then, but fate had just dealt its first card in a game that would change all their lives forever. The revelation came 3 days after Mary and her son moved into the Harrison mansion. Richard and Sandra were having their morning coffee in the sunroom when Mary appeared, holding her son's hand. "Mr. and Mrs. Harrison," she said softly, "I'd like you to meet Nathan." Sandra's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. Richard's newspaper crinkled as his hands tightened involuntarily. There, standing before them, was a miniature version of their son. The same green eyes, the same artistic soul evident in his thoughtful gaze. "Hello," little Nathan said shyly, then held out a piece of paper. "I drew your house." Sandra took the drawing with trembling hands. The detail was extraordinary for a child so young. The mansion's Victorian architecture captured with uncanny accuracy, right down to the distinctive weather vane on the highest tower. "He has quite a talent," Richard managed to say, his voice rough with emotion. "Just like his father," Mary murmured, then caught herself as both Harrisons stared at her. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." "Mary," Richard interrupted, setting aside his paper carefully. "Tell us about Nathan's father, please." The young woman's fingers twisted together nervously. "He was an artist. We met at a small gallery where I worked. He was selling his paintings under a different name because—" She hesitated because he said his family wouldn't approve. "What name?" Sandra whispered, her hands clutching the child's drawing. "He signed everything as N.H. Winter. He said winter was when everything seemed to sleep, waiting for rebirth." Mary's eyes filled with tears. "He never told me his full name, just Nathan. He was so talented, but so sick. One day he just disappeared, left a note saying he didn't want me to watch him die." Richard stood slowly, his imposing frame casting a shadow across the sunlit room. "Come with me, both of you." He led them through the silent hallways to a closed door. Sandra followed, supporting herself against the wall, her breath coming in short gasps. Richard unlocked the door with hands that shook ever so slightly. "This was our son's room," he said, pushing it open. "Our Nathan's room." Mary stepped inside and froze. The walls were covered with paintings, landscapes, portraits, abstract pieces, all signed N.H. Winter. In the center of the room, a large photograph showed a younger, healthier version of the man she had loved. "Oh God!" she gasped, her knees buckling. Little Nathan gripped her hand tighter. "It's him, but that means, Sandra said, her voice breaking, "that this beautiful boy is our grandson." Richard knelt down to Nathan's eye level, seeing his son's features reflected in the child's face. "Nathan, would you like to see more of your daddy's paintings?" The boy nodded eagerly, his eyes wide with wonder. "Daddy was an artist like me?" "Yes," Sandra replied, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, sweetheart, just like you." Mary stood shakily, staring at the photograph. "I never knew, he never told me." "Oh God. All this time you were searching for him?" "We hired every private investigator on the East Coast," Richard said heavily. "But by then he was already with you, wasn't he?" Mary nodded, unable to speak. Little Nathan had wandered to one of the paintings, his small hand reaching up to touch the canvas. "Look, Mommy, it's the park where we used to live." Indeed, it was a painting of the small park near their old apartment, the last place Nathan had lived before disappearing from Mary's life. The piece was dated just weeks before his death. "He loved you both so much," Sandra said softly to Mary. "In the hospital at the end, he was trying to tell us something. Now we know what it was." Richard cleared his throat, fighting for composure. "Mary, Nathan, your family, this is your home now, not as employees, but as our daughter and grandson." The sunlight streaming through the windows caught the tears on everyone's faces, casting rainbow prisms across the room full of artwork. In that moment, surrounded by Nathan's paintings, his legacy lived on through the child who shared not just his name, but his gift. Little Nathan tugged at Sandra's sleeve. "Are you really my grandma?" Sandra gathered him into her arms, her heart somehow feeling stronger than it had in years. "Yes, sweetheart, we're your family, all of us, together." The room that had been preserved as a shrine to grief was suddenly filled with life again, with hope, with the sound of a child's laughter echoing off walls that had been silent for too long. Sometimes it seems the greatest masterpieces are painted not with brushes, but with the delicate strokes of destiny itself. The afternoon light filtered through the dusty curtains of Nathan's bedroom, casting long shadows across the preserved space that had become both shrine and time capsule. Mary stood in the center of the room, her fingers trailing across the spines of art books on the shelves, each one marked with post-it notes and teenage scribbles. "He used to spend hours in here," Richard said softly, watching her explore the space that had housed their son's dreams. "We thought it was just a phase, this art thing. We never realized." Mary picked up a sketchbook from the desk, its pages worn with use. He carried one of these everywhere. Even when he was too weak to paint, he'd sketch. Her voice caught, "I still have some of them." Sandra moved to stand beside her, both women connected by their love for the same man. Would you share them with us someday?" "Of course," Mary whispered, then stopped at a particular photograph on the wall. It showed Nathan at his high school graduation, standing proud in his cap and gown between his parents. "This was how he looked when I first met him, before the illness took hold." Richard's hand clenched at his side. "If we had known, if he had just told us he was sick." "He wouldn't," Mary said, turning to face them. "He was so determined to make it on his own, to prove that art wasn't just a hobby." She smiled sadly. "He was selling paintings, good ones. We weren't rich, but we were happy." Little Nathan had been quietly exploring the room, but now he pointed to a large canvas in the corner. "Mommy, look, it's the bridge where you met Daddy." The painting showed the Brooklyn Bridge at sunset, with two small figures sitting on a bench in the foreground. Mary's hand flew to her mouth. That's where we had our first date. I never knew he painted it." Sandra moved closer to examine the piece. "The detail is extraordinary, the way he captured the light." She turned to Mary with tears in her eyes. "He must have loved you very much." "He did," Mary confirmed, her voice thick with emotion. "And he loved this little one, even though he never got to meet him." She pulled Nathan close to her side. "Sometimes when I look at him drawing, it's like seeing Nathan all over again." Richard cleared his throat, fighting for composure. "We'd like to have the DNA test done, of course. Not because we doubt you, but for legal reasons. For Nathan Jr.'s protection." Mary nodded. "Of course, I understand. Nathan would want his son to be taken care of properly." Sandra reached out and took Mary's hand. "No matter what the test shows, you're both already family to us. This home, it's been so empty without him. Having you here, having our grandson here, it's like he found a way to come back to us." Little Nathan tugged at Richard's sleeve. "Grandpa, can I paint in here too?" The simple question, so innocent yet so profound, broke something open in Richard's heart. He knelt down to the boy's level, seeing his son's eyes looking back at him. "You can paint anywhere you want, son. This is your home now." As the afternoon light began to fade, the four of them stood in that room full of memories, each lost in their own thoughts. But for the first time in years, the grief that permeated the space was tinged with hope, with the promise of new beginnings, with the knowledge that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as ordinary miracles. The DNA test results arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by courier in a plain white envelope. Richard sat at his desk, the unopened envelope before him, while Sandra paced the study floor. "Just open it, Richard," she urged, though they both knew what it would say. They had seen it in every line of little Nathan's face, in every stroke of his crayon across paper. Richard slit the envelope carefully, his hands steady despite the emotion churning inside. He pulled out the paper, scanned it quickly, then looked up at his wife with tears in his eyes. 99.9% probability, he said softly. "He's our grandson, Sandy. He's really ours." Sandra collapsed into a nearby chair, her hand pressed to her heart, not in pain this time, but in overwhelming joy. "Our boy gave us a grandchild even after everything." The sound of laughter filtered through the open window. Mary and little Nathan in the garden, planting flowers in the beds that had been neglected since their son's death. Sandra moved to watch them, her face softening with maternal pride. "Look at her with him, Richard. She's such a good mother. Nathan chose well." Richard joined her at the window. "He did better than we chose, perhaps. She saw who he really was, not who we wanted him to be." We can't change the past, Sandra said, squeezing his hand, but we can make sure his son grows up knowing how much his father was loved by all of us. The transformation in the Harrison household was remarkable. Rooms that had been shrouded in sheets were open to sunlight. The kitchen rang with the sound of family meals being prepared. Sandra's health improved dramatically. Her cardiologist was amazed at the change in her test results. "It's my grandson," she told him proudly. "He's better medicine than anything you could prescribe." Mary had blossomed too, finally able to give her son the stability she'd always dreamed of. She took courses in art education, determined to nurture Nathan Jr.'s talent in a way that would have made his father proud. Richard found himself leaving the office earlier, eager to return home to his expanded family. One evening, he walked in to find little Nathan attempting to teach Sandra how to draw a cat. "No, Grandma. Like this," the boy said patiently, guiding her hand. "See, the whiskers go this way." Richard watched them, his throat tight with emotion. "You know what this means, don't you?" he said later to Sandra. "We have to make it official. Change his birth certificate. Add him to the will, everything." Sandra kissed his cheek. "Already ahead of you, darling. I called the lawyers this morning. The Harrison empire was changing too." Richard had begun to look at his company differently, seeing it not as a legacy to be forced upon an heir, but as a means to support the dreams of future generations, whatever those dreams might be. As autumn turned to winter, the mansion that had once been a mausoleum of memories became a sanctuary of second chances. And somewhere they all felt Nathan was watching, finally at peace, knowing that his family had found each other at last.